from the basement of the beautiful Chrysler building in New York City. This is the Scammies, where I can assure you this episode is 100% AI free. It's all natural intelligence. I'm your host, Michael Robertson. Each episode, I'm trying to make you a little bit smarter so you can spot the scams and the scammers and keep more of your own money. By now, everyone has heard of long COVID. It's an ailment of vague symptoms like brain fog and pounding heart and shortness of breath. I call it a Bigfoot disease because just like reports of Bigfoot in the 70s, it's always blurry black and white photos. In this episode, I'm going to provide evidence that long COVID is a scam and has nothing to do with COVID. I'm not saying that people aren't feeling sick, so maybe it's a half a scam, but it's not related to COVID. Instead, it's due to, well, let me reveal that in a minute. First, let's talk about a clever Norwegian study that proves long COVID has nothing to do with COVID. In Norway, 400 kids and young adults sought out COVID testing, thinking they might be infected. Subsequent testing revealed that 300 had COVID, but the other 100 didn't currently have COVID and actually never had COVID because they did not have the antibodies. All of them felt sick, and some of them were sick with COVID, while others were sick with something else. These 100 without COVID are what is known in studies as the control group. It's the group not receiving the drug, or in this case, the infection. And it's vitally important because now there's something to compare to. All of the study participants were tracked for 6 months. During that time, 48.5% of those who actually had COVID reported long COVID, or what the medical world calls post-COVID conditions, PCC. Because if you have a fancy name, you can get insurance coverage. But surprisingly, a virtually equal number of 47.1% who had never had COVID reported having long COVID too. Post-COVID conditions. Since roughly the same number of people reported having long COVID without ever having COVID, this is powerful evidence that long COVID isn't related to COVID. Furthermore, 14% of those with COVID were also determined to have post-infective fatigue syndrome, PIFS, a more serious variation of long COVID. But again, a roughly similar number of people who had never had COVID reported identical symptoms. The undeniable conclusion is that long COVID has nothing to do with actual COVID. Another less rigorous study, but confirming the Norway finding, looked at the members of a Facebook group for people with long COVID. They tested every member of the group with surprising results. Around 1/3 of the participants in the study did not have antibodies from an infection with coronavirus, meaning they had never been infected with corona, yet they claimed to have long COVID all the same. In a New York Times article, a doctor pondered why 80% of her long COVID patients were white, with few blacks and Hispanics, in spite of blacks and Hispanics experience COVID at a higher overall rate than other races. And 70% of her long COVID patients were female, even though COVID afflicts men at slightly higher rates. So if actually having COVID doesn't lead to long COVID, what does? Well, for this, we're going to turn back to the Norwegian study. They looked at a wide range of possible factors, 78 in total, including sleep, money, negative life events, vitamin B12, sick family members, and many, many more. They actually identified 3 significant factors that contributed to long COVID: symptom severity, loneliness, and low physical activity. What's notable about these is that none has a biological basis, which means there's no biological test that can conclude a person has long COVID. So long COVID joins a long list of other mythical ailments, including fibromyalgia, 9/11 exposure, chronic fatigue, and Havana Syndrome, all of which have wide-ranging symptoms and no medical evidence to prove an actual physical ailment exists. Havana Syndrome is one of the more recent ones. It started with personnel in a U.S. embassy in Havana, Cuba, reporting mostly neurological symptoms, including vertigo, nausea, and brain fog. Brain fog is a common symptom in many of these imaginary sicknesses because it sounds serious. It's measurable, and means little. Now, wild causation theories were manufactured, with the leading candidate being sonar waves being sent by the Cubans into the American embassy. Yeah, the same Cubans who can barely feed themselves had sophisticated ray guns. Actually pretty preposterous. But soon the number of cases reported had surpassed 1,500 and expanded from Cuba to 95 other countries, always afflicting diplomatic staff and military personnel. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence investigated and concluded it was unlikely that a foreign adversary was involved. They didn't comment on the actual cause, but I will. It's a mindcibo. Let me explain. I'm sure you've all heard of a placebo, which is a fake medicine administered to someone who's told it's a real medicine. Almost miraculously, about 20% of the time, they believe it works. If the idea is planted in their head, they make it true in their reality, even though it's just a sugar pill. And there's also nocebos. Nocebos are even more effective than placebos. They're also fake pills, but instead of telling patients that they work, they're told they might experience side effects. And as you might guess, about 25% of the time, those pill takers report experiencing those side effects, even though it's just sugar pills. Which brings us to mindcibos. Instead of pills people swallow, these are thoughts implanted in people's minds. And they spread as a social contagion, just like popular haircuts or clothing styles or children's names, only these are medical ailments. As with placebos and nocebos, some meaningful percentage of those that experience them internalize it and make themselves believe it's happening to them. One remarkable case took place in Portugal in 2006. There was a hugely popular teen drama called Sweet Strawberries, and they aired an episode where an accident with an experimental virus occurred in their high school. My government high school didn't experiment with viruses, but maybe this one had an exchange program with Wuhan High School or something. As you might predict, a student catches the virus, starts coughing, develops a rash, and it spreads quickly throughout the school. The entire school is quarantined, and it's up to the school nerd to solve the case, which they do by the end of the episode. Whew, humanity saved. But fascinatingly, the next week, a wave of reported infections hit Portuguese schools. That imaginary virus had jumped from a TV and become a mindcibo and ended up afflicting more than 300 students from 15 schools who reported symptoms matching those in the TV show. They clogged local hospitals. Some schools were even closed. All because of this imaginary disease. Of course, there were no deaths. Now, medical officials won't call it an imaginary disease or even psychosomatic, likely to avoid laying blame on the patient's mental fragility. Personal responsibility is avoided nowadays, but ultimately it's the solution. Instead, they refer to it with a clinical diagnosis such as contagious dissociative phenomenon that takes place in a large group of people or institutions under conditions of anxiety. Well, who of us doesn't experience anxiety? Which brings us back to long COVID. It is imagined. It's a mindcibo. The idea is planted in a brain, and the person manifests the symptoms to affirm it. I'm sure it feels real to them, but it's not reality. It's psychosis. And in the case of long COVID, it's mass psychosis, afflicting many around the globe with fragile psyches. Maybe a placebo could counter this mindcibo. I hope you'll be on the lookout for mindcibos. Always demand hard evidence before believing. That's this episode of the Scammies. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button and leave a comment. I'm happy to respond. Bye.